1948. Israel was re-established. Gandhi was assassinated. The Soviets blockaded West Berlin, and Samuel L. Jackson was born. It was a really bad time to be living in China, though the same could be said of that entire decade. The war with Japan had ended a few years earlier, just in time for the civil war between the Nationalists and the Communists to resume. And on top of that, there was a hyperinflationary crisis. Yet 1948 was also the year that China would hold a democratic presidential election. Sun Yat-sen, a revolutionary leader who opposed the Qing dynasty and was the founding father of the Republic of China, envisioned a period of political tutelage that would precede constitutional government. During this period of political tutelage, China would essentially be a one-party state under the Kuomintang. The KMT government would prepare the people of China for eventual democracy. China in the years following World War II was in a period of transition from tutelage to constitutional government. In 1947, the name of the army was changed from the National Revolutionary Army to the Republic of China Army, which signified a transfer of control over the armed forces from a party to a country. That same year, the new constitution was enacted and elections were announced. The method of electing the president in 1948 was not by popular vote. Rather, the people would vote for delegates to the National Assembly, which was kind of like an electoral college, who would then vote for the president and vice president. The elections to the National Assembly took place from the 21st to the 23rd of November 1947. Considering how massive China's population is, it makes sense that they'd give people 3 days to vote. 3 parties would contest the elections: the ruling Kuomintang, the Young China Party, and the Democratic Socialist Party. The Kuomintang's full name translates to Chinese National Party. It was and still is a nationalist party. Historically, there were many factions in the KMT, from far left to far right and everything in between. The Young China Party was and still is a conservative party that also supports Chinese nationalism. The Young China Party's leader in this election was Zheng Qi, a journalist and politician from Sichuan, a province in China that's called Szechuan in American Chinese restaurants. The Democratic Socialist Party was a leftist party that nonetheless opposed the communists at a time when many leftists in China were joining forces with the communists, even if they weren't communists themselves. Their leader in this election was Xu Fulin, a politician from Guangdong and a member of the National Political Council. The KMT's main opposition, the Chinese Communist Party, boycotted the election. The China Democratic League also boycotted. Officially, 250 million people out of a total population of 461 million were registered to vote in the National Assembly election. 1947 was the year where Chinese women were first granted the right to vote, which massively increased the number of voters. Eligible voters included anyone over the age of 21, though there were some things that could disqualify you from voting, like treason, political corruption, or opium use. The National Assembly was supposed to have 3,045 seats up for election. Turnout was low and was lower in rural areas than it was in cities. In the cities, Boy Scouts would encourage people to exercise their right to vote. Over 2/3 of the seats were elected by voters in counties and cities across China. The rest were seats reserved for women, ethnic minorities, overseas Chinese, and occupational groups. Overseas Chinese voted for representatives at Chinese consulates. Since China was in a civil war, there were some constituencies that were completely controlled by the communists, including 3 entire provinces. There were between 800 and 900 districts where it was impossible to hold elections. The candidates for districts controlled by the communists would be elected by voters from nearby districts still controlled by the national government. Some members of the National Assembly were appointed rather than elected. Estimates for the number of actual voters varied wildly, from less than 10 million to 350 million. The government's official estimate is that 20 million valid votes were cast, while some American and Australian journalists doubted that even 10 million people voted. It's worth noting that many Western journalists during this time hated Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT, and some of them even sympathized with Mao Zedong. Nevertheless, there were some issues with how the election was conducted. The ballots were blank, meaning that you had to write down the name of the candidate. This doesn't sound too bad until you realize that at the very least, over 1/3 of the Chinese population was illiterate, with some estimates being much higher. The government's solution was to allow the illiterate to have someone else fill out their ballot. I think you can figure out how this system could be abused. The government even acknowledged that criminals had taken advantage of the system and that there were instances where elementary and middle school students were voting. This was, after all, a society that wasn't used to democracy. Chinese Premier Jiang Qun reported that as he went to vote, people gathered around him to look at who he was voting for. He scolded those voters and bemoaned the lack of a secret ballot. When the results were finally counted, the Young China Party won 76 seats, the Democratic Socialists won 68 seats, and then we don't actually know how many seats the Kuomintang won, but we know that it was the vast majority of them. There were some independents too, but we also don't know how many of them were elected. The important thing to take away is that it was a massive KMT landslide. This doesn't tell the whole story, though, as the KMT of the 1940s was not a united party. It was rife with factionalism and internal divisions. The two opposition parties claimed that they were owed a quota of seats much higher than what they got. This caused members of both parties to be angry at the KMT, and there were threats to boycott the National Assembly, which would reduce the legitimacy of the organization. Nevertheless, both parties would participate in the National Assembly and other levels of government in the Republic of China. However, two breakaway parties were formed by Democratic Socialist Party members who opposed participation in the government. The Young China and Democratic Socialist parties both participated in the legislative elections in January 1948, which were also a landslide for the KMT. The members of the National Assembly would meet to elect a president on April 19, 1948. A man who had been elected from a constituency in Xikang province was on his way to Nanjing when he was caught carrying opium and had to be replaced by someone else. Several of those elected in November 1947 died before April 1948. Since the National Assembly was supposed to have 3,045 members, candidates would need to obtain 1,523 votes in order to be elected. However, less than 3,000 members were actually elected, and out of those, only 2,859 actually attended. These men and women would have the responsibility of electing the president and vice president. 19 of them were from Taiwan, and this is the first ROC election where Taiwan participated. The presidential election was pretty simple. There was Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. His opponent would come from his own party. Zhu Zheng was a revolutionary who was serving as the president of the Judicial Yuan, basically China's Supreme Court. Unsurprisingly, Zhu Zheng lost, and it wasn't even close. He won less than 10% of the National Assembly vote. There were also some people who circled both Chiang Kai-shek and Zhu Zheng, but their votes were thrown out. Thus, Chiang Kai-shek's continued position as leader of the area of China not controlled by the communists was secure. Next day came the vice presidential election. This time there were 6 candidates, 4 of whom were KMT members. Sun Ke was the son of Sun Yat-sen. At the time of the election, he was president of the Legislative Yuan, which is basically analogous to Speaker of the House in the United States. Though Sun had been a critic of Chiang Kai-shek's policies, he was still Chiang's favorite pick. Li Zongren was a warlord from Guangxi and a powerful inter-party rival of Chiang Kai-shek. There was a 70-year-old calligraphy master named Yu Youren, who looked like he would have fit in well in the imperial court of any Chinese dynasty. At the time, he was president of the Control Yuan, which has the power to impeach or censure government officials. There was Cheng Chen, a general during World War II and the Civil War. The Young China Party did not run any candidate. The Democratic Socialist Party did, however. They ran Xu Fulin, who was the party's leader in the National Assembly elections. Xu was well aware that he stood no chance at winning, and he ran in order to set an example for Chinese democracy. Finally, Mo Dehui, a member of the National Assembly, ran as an independent. He had connections with the old Fengtian warlords of northeastern China and was of Manchu and Uyghur descent. As the KMT held an overwhelming majority in the National Assembly, it seemed obvious that the winner would be one of the 4 candidates affiliated with that party. The members of the National Assembly were being actively canvassed for their votes. Li Zongren provided each elector a car to take them to their hotel room. Sun Ke and Cheng Chen offered the electors wine and souvenirs. Meanwhile, Yu Youren sat at a desk and waited for people to come to him. He laid out over 2,000 photographs he had signed on a table, one for each elected member of the National Assembly. He didn't have nearly as much money as the other 3, and he wouldn't let anyone fund his campaign. Since Sun was Chiang Kai-shek's preferred pick, not to mention that he was Sun Yat-sen's son, you would think that he'd win easily on the first round. That's where you'd be wrong. He came in second place with only 20% of votes cast. Chiang's rival Li Zongren came in first place, though still far from a majority. Cheng Chen came in third, not far behind Sun Ke. These 3 would advance to the next round. The mudslinging was intense. On the 23rd, the day before the second round, in response to the National Salvation Daily publishing details of Sun Ke's affair, supporters of Sun ransacked the newspaper's office. Li Zongren's concubine was the subject of attacks in the media, and Li himself was accused of being a communist. Li Zongren claimed that government agencies were using threats and bribes to coerce members of the National Assembly to vote for Sun. On the 24th, there was a second round. Once again, Li came in first, Sun in second, and Chung in third. No one obtained a majority. After the second round, all three remaining candidates announced that they wanted to withdraw from the race, but they were convinced to remain. On the 28th, there was a third round. Yet again, Li came in first, Sun came in second, and Chung came in third. No one obtained a majority. However, Chung's support was falling and the race was a close competition between Chung's preferred candidate and his rival. Chung would not advance to the fourth round. He switched his support to Li Zongren. The fourth round was held on the 29th. This time, the rules were changed. Only a majority of actual votes were necessary, instead of a majority of the 3,045 people who were supposed to have been elected in November. And with just two candidates in the race, there was going to be a winner. Li Zongren defeated Sun Ke 1,438 to 1,295. When Chiang Kai-shek heard that Li had won, he kicked his radio in anger. The election was finally over. And it really goes to show you that Chiang Kai-shek's power back then wasn't absolute as we tend to think of it today. On May 20th, 1948, Chiang Kai-shek was inaugurated as president, and Li Zongren was inaugurated as vice president. That day would be celebrated with lanterns and firecrackers in the nationalist capital of Nanjing. Li was told to wear a military uniform while Chiang Kai-shek wore civilian clothes. While giving his inaugural address, Chiang acted as if Li wasn't even in the room with him, and Li felt as if he was going out of his way to embarrass him. This was a sign of things to come. The two men wouldn't reconcile, and their rivalry hurt the nationalist war effort going forward. In his inaugural address, Chiang Kai-shek acknowledged democracy in China was still weak, but expressed hope for the future. Opposition leader Zheng Qi of the Young China Party also expressed hope that things would be better in 6 years when the next presidential election would be held. But the real contest for China's leadership was not at the ballot box, it was on the battlefield. As his term began, Chiang Kai-shek controlled the majority of China, including most of China's major cities. The tide of war was turning against the government, however. By the end of the year, the situation was beginning to look hopeless, as communist forces controlled most of northern China and were quickly advancing south. The front lines were now close to the capital. Chiang Kai-shek had already announced his resignation, and Li Zongren would become acting president in January 1949. On April 24th, 1949, Nanjing fell and communist soldiers entered the presidential palace. The nationalist government had already retreated to Guangzhou, and it would continue to retreat from the advancing People's Liberation Army until the government was relocated to Taipei. On October 1st, Mao Zedong declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China, proclaiming victory in the Chinese Civil War. With this in mind, it would be easy to conclude that the elections under the nationalist government were worthless, that they didn't accomplish anything. However, this is not the case. Chiang Kai-shek relocated the nationalist government to Taiwan. Just over half the members of the National Assembly came with him. They would not have to stand for re-election, as the vast majority of them represented districts no longer controlled by the Republic of China. They would continue to be responsible for electing the president and vice president. The members of the National Assembly, elected in 1948 on mainland China, continued to make up the majority of the National Assembly until they were forced to retire in 1991. They, along with the members of the Legislative Yuan who fled to Taiwan, formed the so-called 10,000-Year Congress, made up of elected officials who served for 43 years. In 1954, the Republic of China would hold a presidential election again, though it would be a very different situation than in 1948. So what happened to the candidates after 1948? Chiang Kai-shek led the nationalist government in Taiwan from 1949 to his death. From there, he would officially resume his presidency while claiming to be the legitimate ruler of all of China. He vowed to take back the mainland from the communists. He died of a heart attack in 1975. His son, Chiang Ching-kuo, served as president from 1978 to 1988. About 2 months ago, as of this recording, his great-grandson, Wayne Chung, was elected mayor of Taipei. Li Zongren attempted to make peace with the communists, but was unsatisfied with the peace terms that the communists offered. He fled to the United States after Guangzhou fell in 1949. He denounced Chiang Kai-shek as a tyrant and vowed to return to China to crush Chiang Kai-shek. Of course, the area of China that Chiang still controlled by that point was small and shrinking by the day. Later, the nationalist government in Taiwan would officially impeach him. Li eventually did return to China in 1965 when he met Mao Zedong and complimented him on his swimming skills. He died of cancer in 1969. Zhu Zheng, Chiang Kai-shek's opponent in the presidential election, fled to Taiwan along with the government. He founded Tom Kung University in Tom Sui in 1950 and died in 1951. Sun Ke fled to Hong Kong in 1949. He would spend the next 16 years living in Europe and the United States before coming to Taiwan to serve in Chiang Kai-shek's government once more. He died of a heart attack in 1973. Cheng Chen was appointed governor of Hunan after his failed vice presidential bid. Instead of fleeing China, he negotiated a peaceful surrender with the communists. He would serve in a variety of positions in the People's Republic of China. He died of pneumonia in 1968. Yu Yo-ren fled to Taiwan with the government. He continued to write poetry and served as president of the Control Yuan. He died of pneumonia in 1964. After his death, a statue of him was built and placed on Yushan, or Jade Mountain, the highest peak in Taiwan. The statue is facing mainland China, a place Yu Yo-ren missed and a place where much of his family still lived. In 1995, some political activists staged a bizarre ritual where they pretended to worship the statue before saying, "Let's send you back to China as soon as possible," and decapitating it. Mo Dewey also fled to Taiwan. He would be appointed the president of the Examination Yuan, a branch of government that deals with the selection of civil servants. He died in 1968. Xu Fulin fled to Taiwan with the government. In 1954, he unsuccessfully ran for president. In 1955, he became the chairman of the Democratic Socialist Party. He died in 1958. Zheng Qi, the leader of the Young China Party, was quoted by Time magazine as saying that he hoped the next election would be better. He didn't live to see the next election. He died in 1951 in Washington, D.C. Today, the Kuomintang is a major political party in Taiwan and was in power there from 1945 to 2000 and again from 2008 to 2016. As of 2023, it holds power across Taiwan at the local level, though the president and the majority of the members of the Legislative Yuan are part of the rival Democratic Progressive Party. This may change in next year's elections, and the party may regain the presidency and the Legislative Yuan. The Young China and Democratic Socialist parties were the only two legal opposition parties until the 1980s. The two parties cooperated with the Kuomintang, and their members were given positions in the government. Today, the Young China Party has no elected officials but is active on social media. They argue for the reunification of China under the Republic of China government. The Democratic Socialist Party was disbanded in 2020, though it hadn't contested any elections since the early 90s. Since the Nationalists never took back the mainland, all subsequent elections would be held in Taiwan and a few other islands still controlled by the Republic of China. This video is the start of a series on the elections held in Taiwan. I'm hoping to make those videos be of higher quality, so I hope to have you back when I eventually make them.